Hi, it's Roger. I'm back, and we're picking up here on the smoke testing section for the Azure Virtual WAN configuration in the Azure Sandbox. So we're going to be doing our smoke testing from our client environment, which is Windows with WSL. And we're going to establish a point-to-site VPN connection from our client environment, which is running on my home network, to the Sandbox, Azure Sandbox running in Azure. So there's kind of two different sections here in the smoke testing. The first section is installing and configuring the VPN client. And the second section is testing point-to-site connectivity. So let's proceed with this first section here, installing and configuring the VPN client. So we've already installed the VPN client as part of our client environment configuration. So that app should already be installed. It's called the Azure VPN client. So here it is running. So I guess the first thing we need to do is download the user VPN profile. So we're going to go up to the Azure portal to do that. And we'll navigate down into Virtual WAN. So here's the virtual WAN that we provisioned, and that should have a single hub associated with it. And here's our hub. And the VPN gateway is provisioned in that hub. So I'll click on that, and here's our hub. So let's see where we download this profile, this VPN profile. So we go into the hub and we go into the user VPN point to site, which I believe is here. And here is the download link for the Virtual Hub user VPN profile. And I believe we select the EAP-TLS profile type, and we will generate this and download it. Okay, so if we go to our downloads folder, here it is, and I'll go ahead and just unzip that. And you can see here in this Azure VPN folder is the XML file that we'll need to import into the Azure VPN config, into the Azure VPN client. So if we pull up the Azure VPN client, we can import a new VPN connection. And I'm going to point it to that file. So we'll go to our downloads. There's our folder, and there's our XML file. Okay, so we get all kinds of pre-configured stuff. I think we're good here. Let's just check our instructions really quick and see if we need to do anything else. Okay, I think we're okay here. Okay, I think we need to choose the certificate here. So we're going to choose the child certificate. And we can see that because that PFX was automatically registered on my in my client environment when we ran that script that generated those self-signed certificates. So let's go ahead and save this. And here we can see our profile that was just imported. Now we haven't connected up yet. All right, so let's try to go ahead and connect. Okay, cool. So a bunch of routes came across. So 10.1 is for VNet shared. 10.2 is for VNet app. 10.3 is for our vWAN hub. 10.4 is where we have our client IP addresses for the user VPN or the point to site VPN. And you can see here that here's the address from 10.4 that was assigned to my VPN connection. So we got a nice little green light here and things look good. Very cool. So next we're going to move on to test VPN connectivity. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to try to RDP into JumpWin 1. So the first thing that we'll do is try to run a DNS query here to make sure that DNS resolution is working from my client environment, which has this VPN connection now into my sandbox. So I'll go ahead and run that command. And the DNS queries are working. So I can find JumpWin 1. My DNS server responded. And I know the IP address for that is 10.2.0, which is that application subnet in VNet app. So that's good. DNS is working to JumpWin 1. Okay, so we're going to run remote desktop connection, which is really the RDP client for Windows. And in there, we're going to type in jumpwin1.mysandbox.local using our domain admin credentials, which are listed here. Okay, and now I'm going to need to provide the password so I can get that from our key vault. Secrets, admin password, copy. And voila, we have an RDP connection over VPN to JumpWin 1. Super cool. So we know RDP is working to Windows Server, and we also know that our DNS queries are working. So I'll go ahead and sign out of there. That test is complete. Let's close that. Didn't mean to bring up that browser window. We'll bring this one back up. And let's go look at our second test case. I think that's all I needed to do. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is test SSH connectivity to jump Linux 1. It's a different port. So for here, what I'm going to do is copy this SSH command, and PowerShell includes OpenSSH. So perfect. So it'll automatically add this to the host file. So I'll say yes. And now it wants the password, which is, the challenge phrase that we use for that is the same as our admin password. So I'll grab that from here, back to my PowerShell terminal, and I'll paste that password in. And boom, we have an SSH connection to Jump Linux 1. So and we're logged in using domain credentials using Kerberos. So if I do say a az-version, we can see that we have the Azure CLI installed out there, and everything is working as expected. So that's test number 2. SSH connectivity is working over VPN, and I didn't have to go through Bastion to do it. I'm doing it directly from my client environment. All right, what is our next test scenario? So we tested RDP through port 3389. We tested SSH through port 22. Now we're going to test SMB connectivity to our Azure Files share. So that port 445 is typically shut down on most ISPs for security reasons. But since we have a VPN connection, port 45 should work. So the first thing that we're going to do is run a DNS query from our client environment, which is connected via VPN, to the fully qualified domain name for that Azure Files domain name. So if I pull up our storage account, here's the storage account that's part of our sandbox. And if I go into endpoints, we see here the endpoint for the file service, which is the endpoint that I want to test DNS resolution to. So I'm going to pull up my PowerShell terminal, and I'm going to do a resolve DNS name against that fully qualified domain name. I'm going to get rid of the HTTPS. So this will test whether DNS queries will resolve for Azure Files, and whether the particular storage account that hosts our Azure Files share, the private endpoint for that is working over a VPN connection. And it is. So I go to the public fully qualified domain name, and what I get back is the A record that we have provisioned in our private DNS zone which points us to the private link, private endpoint associated with that Azure file share, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want. So DNS is working. And next I'm going to do this net use command. So it's going to be to map a drive. So I can map a drive from my client environment to connect to an Azure file share private endpoint over a VPN connection. But since my client environment isn't domain joined to my sandbox local, I'm going to have to specify a different user when I do the net use command here. Okay. So let's just type this whole thing out because I have the fully qualified domain name already in my clipboard. So I'm going to do a net use z : double backslash. Then it would be the fully qualified domain name for our host for Azure Files. Get rid of the HTTPS. And I believe the default share that we used is my file share. And we're going to use this /user : bootstrap admin at mysandbox.local. And now it should prompt me for a password, which is the same good old password we always use, our admin password. So let me go back into our key vault and get that. And we'll paste the password in. And voila, we have a mapped drive to Z. And I can create directories. And I can even start up Notepad. We'll start up a hello world.txt file. And you can see that Notepad gets launched. You didn't see this prompt, but it asked me if it wanted to create the file hello world.txt. And I said yes. And I say, hello world. And if we go back to our terminal, if I do a dir, there's our hello world.txt file. Okay. So we have mapped a drive using SMB file sharing to an Azure file share exposed through a private endpoint in our Azure Sandbox. And we're connecting to that share and that via that private endpoint over a point-to-site VPN connection from a client environment that exists outside of the Azure Sandbox. So now I can copy data back and forth into my sandbox on this share, whatever it is I want to do. So that test worked successfully as well. Very cool. So we've tested RDP, we've tested SSH, we've tested SMB. Now we're going to test TDS, which is the SQL Server Tabular Data Stream Protocol. We're going to make sure that we can connect to SQL Server on our SQL Server virtual machine running in the sandbox. So for that, I'm going to run SQL Management Studio, which I already have pre-installed in my client environment. There it is. Sometimes it takes SQL Server Management Studio a little time to launch. Okay, we got SQL Server Management Studio running. So what are we going to connect to? Let's try our SQL Server VM, which we know is called MS SQL Win 1, right? Yep. Oh, MSSQL win1.mysandbox.local. We'll go ahead and put the full local domain name. And we're going to log in as SA because remember, we cannot, this machine is not domain joined. So we will not be able to log into SQL Server using Windows Integrated Authentication because we're not logged in to the same domain from this client environment. And I think I already have my password up, but let me just double check. I'll copy it in here again just in case. And punch that in and connect. Okay, we got our connection. Yes, smoke testing that I've done on previous builds of the sandbox. So that got reset, and we're now connected to a SQL Server virtual machine running in our Azure Sandbox from a client that is outside of the Azure Sandbox connected in through a point-to-site VPN connection. And we should be able to see all the databases here and all that good stuff. So we are in good shape for that test. Excellent. So let me exit out of, or let me just disconnect because I think we're going to connect to Azure SQL Database through a private endpoint now. Let's see. So RDP test check, SSH test check, SMB test check, TDS to SQL VM check. Now we're going to do TDS to Azure SQL Database. So let's test the DNS name resolution first. So let's go to find the SQL logical server and get the fully qualified domain name for that logical server, which is here. And let's do a resolve DNS name against that. Beautiful. So same thing. Our DNS query is working against our private endpoint. You can see here 10.2.2.5, so that's a private endpoint. It's working because of the A record we have set up for that host in our private DNS zone for database.windows.net that is linked to our virtual network. And then I get all that same DNS functionality now on my client because I have a VPN connection in. So DNS queries to Azure SQL Database private endpoint are working. So next, let's go try to connect to this thing. So let's see if we can figure it out without looking at the docs. I'm going to say connect to a database engine. I'm going to put the fully qualified domain name. I'm going to connect using SQL Server Authentication, using this time not SA, but Bootstrap Admin. And I need to go get my password again. Cool. I'm thinking this should work. Boom. So we have connected to Azure SQL Database from a client that is outside of our Azure Sandbox over a VPN connection to a private endpoint. And DNS queries are working. So we can check all those check boxes. So that is, I think, all the SQL Server testing. I think we're safe to disconnect here and get out of SQL Server Management Studio. So the last thing that we need to test, I'm thinking, is probably MySQL Flexible Server, which is port 3306. That's typically the port that's used for MySQL connections. We want to make sure that connectivity to that private endpoint is set up. So similar process. We're going to go find the fully qualified domain name for our Flex server. So I'm going to pull up the Azure database for MySQL Flexible Servers. And I'm going to copy the fully qualified domain name for that. And then from our command prompt, I'm going to test to see if DNS queries are working to the private endpoint. And they are. This is that 10.2.3 delegated subnet, which has the private endpoint for my Azure SQL database. Cool. So next, we should try to connect up to this host, this MySQL Flex server host using MySQL Workbench, which I believe I have installed. So go up to database, we'll go to connect. And here we're going to stick that host name in. And the username, I believe, is going to be bootstrap admin. And I think I need to put a password in here. So we'll go get our password from Key Vault. And the default schema is going to be testdb. Yay! So we have successfully connected from our client environment running outside of the Azure Sandbox over a VPN connection to Azure MySQL Flexible Server using a private endpoint that's in our Sandbox environment. Okay. And I think that that is the last test that we do in our smoke testing. And it is. So in the next video, I'll pick up on the documentation and we'll walk through some of the code that's involved in this VWAN configuration. Thanks, everybody.